Hi there, Sandra here from Create in Spain. Have you ever looked at your colouring and thought it needs a little bit of a boost? If you're doing card making, maybe you've got alcohol markers and you're not really that sure on how to use them. You've got the basics of a few shadows and things, but they're still not popping. Okay, I'm going to try and help you with that with a couple of techniques which should make things a little better. I've started off with an image which I have here. Now notice this image is printed off, and it's printed off in a pale grey because I don't want really hard outlines on my design. It's okay if you're going for a cartoony style, but if you want to avoid that cartoony clip art look, then you need to ditch the hard black lines. It's why I quite often like to use a pale grey for stamping if I do stamp anything out. Sometimes I'll use a black, but generally speaking that's because I am trying to film something and you can see it easier. So these teddy bears, if you have a close look at these, you'll find there's a few differences aside from the obvious colour ones. These bears here don't really have a great deal of texture to them. They are shaded, but they have little texture, except for this one here, which is more textured. Out of these bears here, brighter coloured ones, they don't have texture either, except for that one, which does have a little more texture. And those two bears are a little more alive, a little more wowy than the other ones. But what is the difference? Because I did use pretty much the same colouring technique for all of these bears. My colouring technique tends to go from dark to light. I try and put in some shadows and blend a little bit. I don't spend ages blending because this is for card making. This isn't, for me, a work of art that's going to go on the wall, and I don't necessarily want to spend hours colouring tiny little bears. They may be the focal point of the card, but they're not the focal point of my life, and I have other things that I want to do. So what did I do which was different with these two bears that I didn't do with the rest? And the answer is so simple and so easy that you'll wonder why you never actually thought of it. The texture is easy to do, but not if you're using an alcohol marker. There is no reason why, just because you start off with an alcohol marker, that you have to finish with an alcohol marker. If I was doing a woodwork project and I was, I don't know, making a piece of furniture, I might start off with a circular saw, but I wouldn't finish with a circular saw. I'd be using a tool which is more suitable for sanding. You get the gist. So what I've been using are these things. Now, it doesn't have to be this brand, it could be any brand. In fact, I think Arteza do something like these now, I think. I haven't got any, but I think they do them. So for example, pick one of these. It's a very, very, very fine point. Okay. And the technique for getting texture, I'm going to do this in a bigger format just so that you can see. You're a spider going over the page. You're just wandering around looking for something that you haven't seen yet. And that is literally all it is, only done in a much smaller scale. And the areas where I did it were the areas which were darker shaded in the first place. I chose a colour that was pretty much mid-range, light to mid-range. On my darker areas, you can always go in with a darker colour if it's not quite dark enough. You can use this type of thing. You could use a very sharp pointed pencil if you've got one sharp enough in the right colour. But basically it is just scribbling. That will provide on a small item like a stamp adequate texture to simulate fur or something that isn't absolutely flat smooth. There's another couple of techniques that you can use depending on what you're actually filling in. The next one is simply dots, like that. Just tap, 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 random pattern. And you will create areas of light and shade. You can do straight lines, you can do crosshatch. It just depends on what you are trying to add texture to. And you need to think about what it is that you're doing. If you were doing a fabric maybe for, I don't know, a denim jacket or something like that, then the crosshatch might be a worthwhile technique. If you were trying to do straightforward fur, then maybe just short little strokes like that would do the job. So just try adding a little bit of texture, but don't force yourself to use your Copic markers or your Ohuhu or your Arteza markers, whatever it is, to finish the job. Alcohol markers are great for colouring in, and if you're doing a larger project, yeah, they're fine for adding texture. But if you're working on something this small, why would you want to use something which is really a little too big to do the job? If you're an expert with markers, then yes, there's a high chance you'll be able to do it no matter what you're using. But if you're a beginner, or if you're intermediate, or if you just want to do a job quickly and easily, why force yourself to use something when it's going to make life more difficult for you, just because that's what you started out with? So that is my first tip for getting some realism into your items. Now the next one involves shadows, but not the shadows that you put actually on your item. Shadows are created when things have got light and dark areas in front or behind them. If the light comes from in front, then the shadow will be behind. If the light comes from behind, the shadow is in front, and again, side to side. It can be difficult to work out where those shadows need to be, how much shadow you need to have, what colours that you want to use. Now I tend, if I'm doing shadows, usually to avoid the greys, I tend to go for something a little lilac-y, maybe something blue, maybe a combination of that with a grey. But that is personal taste, and it depends on what effect you want to get. So what I thought I'd do is show you what you can do to work out what sort of shadows you like. And it's quite simple. If you have a cutting machine, as I do, what you want to do is create an offset. If you were doing lettering as a main focal point of your card, you might well put an offset on it, mightn't you? Well, what you can do is use that same offset that you would normally use for lettering to see what it would do to ground your object that isn't lettering. And you can move, put your shadow down, you can move your item on top to see what effect you would get and where the shadows would actually be. You can decide how big you would like your shadow, where it's going to come also behind whatever it is that you're doing. If you notice here, if I just take a pencil, just here behind this bear here, I've got shadow area, because he would normally cast a shadow. If this was being used as the light direction, that's where a shadow would be. But the other thing you can do is you can do an even bigger offset, put that down, and then you can put this down on here, and you can see again where the shadow would be. Now, the size of the shadow depends on how close your light source would be. Now, if you want a larger shadow area, then you would graduate your colour from the darker colour to the lighter colour. Now this is very simplistic because I've just cut it out of card, but it gives you an indication of what you would be doing if you were colouring that with your markers. You'd have a darker area up close, and the further you get away, the lighter it goes. But it also gives you an indication of the shape that that shadow would be casting. It's just a very useful tool. Now, why would you want to do all these shadows? It's pretty simple. You put something like that flat down on a card, it's not grounded. It doesn't look like it belongs there. It looks like they're floating in midair, and they're not. You need shadows underneath things because they would cast shadows. If these were real bears, if I had a pile of teddy bears and sat them on my desk, they would cast shadows. And so you need to have your shadows if you were looking for anything remotely like realism. I admit, largely on my card making, that's about the last thing I'm looking for. So I don't necessarily bother with it. But if you want to have something like this just as a focal point, you probably do want a little more realism than just stamping something out, cutting it out directly and colouring it in, even if you put the shadows on the body. So that's it. Something for you to think about, and nothing very, very difficult. And the shadow technique using cutouts is really easy to do if you have a cutting machine. And I'm sorry, I do think that having an electronic cutting machine is by far the best thing that any card maker can have. I am completely and utterly biased on that. I've tried using dies. They frustrate me because I can't do exactly what I want to do with a die. Not even if I bought every single die that I thought I wanted. I would still want to alter the sizes. I would still want to put shadow layers on. I would still, yeah, you get the idea. So that's it. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you again soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.